First-generation Japanese immigrants known as the Issei arrived in Oregon between the years 1885 and 1952. Many came on ships across the Pacific, landing in California or Washington, and then traveling to Oregon from there. Immigrants arriving in the 1890s came to find work on railroads, but found upon arrival that no work was to be had. However, those already established immigrants in the area assisted the newcomers in finding work on farms or on railroads in Oregon and Idaho. By 1900, due to a labor shortage created by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, railroad jobs became a major source of employment for Japanese immigrants. And by 1907, 40% of Oregon Railroad laborers were Japanese immigrants. Jobs in canneries were also available to the Japanese, as was work in the lumber industry. Some immigrants were able to open small businesses, and by 1909, Portland had 97 Japanese businesses, of which 14 were Western-style restaurants, 11 were Japanese restaurants, 13 were bathhouses, 12 were hotels and boarding houses, 10 were barber shops, and 8 were grocery stores. A large portion of Japanese immigrants became farmers, a natural choice, as many of them had been farmers in Japan. By 1909, 1/4 of the Japanese in Oregon were farm laborers, and the Gresham Troutdale region was prominent among Japanese farm settlements. Most of the farmers became tenant farmers with 3 to 6 year contracts. They paid around $15 per acre, which was a high rent for the time. White farmers welcomed Japanese tenants as they often made more money by renting farmland to them than if they had tended the farm themselves. By 1904, Japanese berry and vegetable farms emerged, and by 1920, local Japanese farmers in Gresham Troutdale occupied 50% of the raspberry acreage, 90% of strawberry acreage, 30 to 40% of the loganberry acreage, and 60% of all vegetable and truck gardens. With an initial 50 members in 1918, Japanese immigrants in Gresham organized a farmers' association to market their crops and purchase needed equipment and supplies. Hood River was another popular site for Japanese settlers. At the turn of the century, the area was still heavily forested. In order to clear their land quickly, white settlers with land claims in the area promised 5 acres of land to any Japanese immigrant who cleared 15 acres of land. This was very enticing for many immigrants, as they could relatively easily become landowners in this way, as opposed to being land tenants in Gresham Troutdale. Many Japanese immigrants settled permanently in Hood River. Initially, the immigrants coming to Oregon were mostly male laborers who simply came to work in order to earn money and then return home to their families in Japan. They did not intend to settle. Limited mobility, caused by the passing of the Gentleman's Agreement in 1907-1908, led to the onset of picture brides. This brought an unexpected influx of Japanese women to the United States. Many Japanese women agreed to be picture brides in order to travel to the United States, believing they would find more freedom in the U.S. than in Japan. Issei wives in Oregon played many roles in the family, and were not confined to the traditional subordination they would have faced in Japan. Here, women were in charge of the domestic chores, raising the children, and helping out on the farms. They worked just as hard as their husbands. Perhaps the most well-known Japanese woman in Oregon was Mio Iwakoshi, the first Japanese settler in the state. Mio came to Oregon with her husband Andrew McKinnon and their adopted daughter, Tama Nitobe. The family settled just outside of Gresham, where McKinnon helped to establish a steam-powered sawmill, which he named Orient, in honor of his wife and daughter. The community of Orient still exists today. The success of Japanese farmers in Gresham Troutdale and Hood River created agricultural competition, and began to make white farmers uneasy. To combat this competition and secure an agricultural foothold, many Japanese farmers focused on crops typically ignored by white farmers. Strawberries were popular amongst Japanese farmers, as many white farmers disliked the labor-intensive nature of the crop. The animosity felt by white farmers led to the formation of the Oregon Alien Land Bill and the Oregon Alien Business Restriction Law, both of which passed in 1923. The Alien Land Bill prohibited Japanese immigrants from owning and leasing land, labeling the Issei as aliens ineligible to citizenship. In order to keep their farms, many Issei farmers put their land leases in their children's names. Second-generation Japanese, the Nisei, were American-born and American citizens, and therefore the Alien Land Bill did not apply to them. The Alien Business Restriction Law targeted businesses commonly owned or run by immigrants, allowing the municipal government to refuse business licenses to aliens for the operation of pawn shops, pool halls, dance halls, and soft drink establishments. It also required hotels and grocery stores to post a sign in their window listing the nationality of the owner, permitting customers to boycott immigrant-owned businesses. In 1924, the Immigration Act was passed, which included an Asian Exclusion Act, prohibiting further entry of Japanese into the United States. All of these discrimination policies combined resulted in a mass Japanese exodus from Oregon between the years 1924 and 1928. Additional hardships were felt by Japanese residents of Oregon during World War II. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the Secretary of War to prescribe certain areas along the western coast of the United States as military zones. Wary that Japanese citizens may place loyalties to the Japanese emperor over their new country, the U.S. government authorized the relocation and internment of roughly 120,000 Japanese residents. Initially, these residents were encouraged to relocate voluntarily. This required that any resident of Japanese heritage move out of the designated military zones along the west coast. Eastern Oregon was not included within the military zones, and thus residents could relocate further east within the state. Following this voluntary relocation was a forced relocation of any remaining Japanese residents who had failed to evacuate the military zones. Japanese residents, both foreign-born as well as those born in the United States, were located and moved to civil control stations. The Gresham Fairgrounds served as one of these civil control stations. Residents were only allowed to bring what they could carry. Business owners were forced to close their stores and sell off their goods. Families oftentimes lost their homes and any possessions left behind. A few lucky residents found neighbors willing to watch over their property or possessions, but the majority lost everything. From there, residents were taken to assembly centers, like the Portland Expo Center, formerly known as the Pacific International Livestock Association Building. Residents were held at this Portland Assembly Station for 5 months. Families and individuals were forced to live in old cattle stalls, hanging cloth across open spaces to form rudimentary doors. Living conditions were appalling. Following their detainment at the livestock building, residents were divided up and sent to one of 10 internment camps. Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Tule Lake and Manzanar in California, Topaz in Utah, Poston and Gila River in Arizona, Granada in Colorado, Minidoka in Idaho, and Jerome and Roher in Arkansas. No charges were made against the Japanese residents detained by the U.S. government, and they were not permitted to appeal their incarceration. Personal liberties were lost, along with their possessions and property. Questionnaires were distributed amongst the interned residents, containing a series of questions designed to gauge each person's loyalty. These questions oftentimes led to mass confusion. Nevertheless, Nisei were encouraged to enlist and serve in the U.S. Armed Forces, and some were even drafted. Overall, more than 30,000 Japanese Americans served in segregated units during World War II. Internment lasted until December 18, 1944. A few acts and amendments were passed in the 1950s and 60s, offering Japanese residents token payments only for some of their property lost during internment. It wasn't until the 1980s, however, that serious efforts were put forward to make amends. Public Law 100-383 was passed in 1988, officially acknowledging the injustice of the internment, apologizing for this injustice, and providing restitution to those who had suffered.